Hey everyone, there we are. Greetings, it's Naomi Wolf, and I'm back. I haven't seen you for about a week. I was in India, Delhi, for the India Today conclave, in which I brought the findings of the Pfizer documents to India. Interestingly, Bill Gates went to India to champion the vaccines, in which he's an investor, the week after I did that. I'm not saying he noticed, but India Today is like the Newsweek or Time Magazine of India, and it was brave of them to cover the Pfizer papers findings, and it did get national press. So it's interesting that there's that debate going on right now in India. And I want to really appreciate India Today for being brave enough to bring this conversation forward very unhesitatingly. No one stopped me from saying everything that I had to say, which was very refreshing, given how much I've been censored, with this conversation. I'm wearing a beautiful scarf that I got in Jaipur, and I am glad to see you all again. Thank you for joining me. This is Outspoken on Daily Clout, and what I wanted to do today was read you an essay I wrote last week when I was in India about Europe's wars and about what I witnessed when I was in Europe, right around the time that President Trump was confronting President Zelensky and also saying we're not going to pay more than our fair share for Europe's defense. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I certainly see that it looks like I'm being quite shadow banned, but I'm kind of used to that. So I'm just going to plunge ahead. And as always, please give me your comments and observations and questions in the chat. So here we go. It's called Europe's Own Wars, Updating a U.S.-Europe Relationship Frozen in 1949. President Trump's announcement, which followed a dramatic live confrontation in the White House on February 28, 2025, with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, that the American president would suspend all aid to Ukraine, caused shockwaves around the world. This was followed by President Trump's declaration that the United States would no longer pay disproportionately for Europe's defense in NATO, and that he would not defend his NATO allies if they did not pay their fair share. Quote, "It's common sense, right?" End quote, Trump told reporters in the Oval Office. "If they don't pay, I'm not going to defend them. No, I'm not going to defend them." End quote. The president's supporters, especially those in the United States, cheered these moves. They object to what looks at times like a global shell game that enriches all who collude with it, with this collusion coming at the cost, as the president pointed out, of 2,000 Russian and Ukrainian soldiers' lives a week. These Americans see our refusal to overpay for our role in NATO as being a long overdue stop to a multi-billion-dollar, decades-long gravy train that has sustained since 1949 what are in fact now wealthy societies. NATO's, you can see, this is pretty funny, but the picture I chose, is of a European guy with a lady on his bike, on his moped, looking super cheerful as he's driving along what looks like a Greek or Italian oceanfront. NATO's founding origins in the misery, fear, and rubble of post-World War II Europe made sense at the time. How did the agreement start? Quote, "The result of these extensive 1949 negotiations was the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949, that's NATO. In this agreement, the United States, Canada, Belgium, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United Kingdom agreed to consider attack against one an attack against all, along with consultation about threats and defense matters. This collective defense arrangement only formally applied to attacks against the signatories that occurred in Europe and North America. It did not include conflicts in colonial territories. Later in 1949, President Truman proposed a military assistance program, and the Mutual Defense Assistance Program passed the US Congress in October, appropriating some $1.4 billion for the purpose of building Western European defenses, end quote. But that was then. The conditions that led us to consider it useful to join forces with Europe and to agree for us to defend one another still apply in a world full of threats and anti-Western sentiment. But I'll argue that the conditions that led the US to assume a disproportionate share of the financial burden do not exist any longer, and that President Trump is right to course correct on our disproportionate payments to Europe. President Trump says that the US has spent $300 to $350 billion on defense of Ukraine. The BBC argues that it is much less, $119.7 billion, but still the outsized amount that America has provided is stunning to consider in relation to Europe's far more limited contributions. The BBC's chart below shows that our $119.7 billion, if we'll accept that number, contrasts sharply with France's $5.1 billion and the EU as a total's $51.3 billion. Add to this disparity the fact that the vast majority of Europe's funds heading to Ukraine arrive in the form of loans, not grants, as opposed to the outright wealth transfers made by the United States. I actually hadn't known that. In other words, in theory at least, the money with which Europe is parting is not meant to be lost to European lender nations forever. And here you can see charts, the top donor nations, and there you can see the difference between our outright grants, the blue line, their second line, versus their grants and loans. I'm sorry, the top line is the United States, and that green segment is a grant, and right below that is EU institutions who are just making loans. They're barely making grants at all. And the same is true for Japan, Canada, UK, Germany. We're just basically pumping money directly into Ukraine. European elites, of course, see these moves on the part of President Trump very differently than do President Trump's supporters, and as does European media. European elites and press commentators are at the very thought that the disproportionate US money spigot for NATO and for Ukraine in particular may be turned off, are sustaining an existential crisis. I was in Europe as much of this started to play out, and the expressions of shock, but more significantly, entitled shock, were audible everywhere one turned. The reaction was not an adult one. Quote, well, that's over. It's time to figure out how we will manage without the outsized commitment of the United States. One did not even hear many mature, thoughtful arguments aimed at America that this withdrawal is bad for all of us. One heard rather a range of crude coping mechanisms from European thought leaders. They mocked the president and his decisions, or they expressed flustered outrage. Some actually suggested that the president acts as he does because Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, quote, has something on him, end quote. The hostility was unremitting. I am not a psychologist, but this reaction is fascinating to me because it is so defensive, irrational, and, well, so adolescent. These howls were emitted in the tone of people against whom a crime is being committed. This reaction begs the question, why? Did Europe think that the status quo, an unaccountable American money spigot paying for the defense of Europe, would last forever? Did Europe's elites and media imagine that American presidents would change, but that the policy related to our paying for European defense, one initiated under one US president decades ago, would stay the same throughout all time under every president? Did the leaders of these nations and their spokespeople and media never have or even imagine a plan B? Some commentators slowly started dealing with the fact that Europe will have to step up in its own defense. Quote, the message is clear and, quote, electroshock, end quote. As French President Emmanuel Macron called it, European countries will have to step up defense spending if they intend to protect themselves from Russian aggression, end quote. As European leaders come to terms with the new reality, the incredible military emasculation of Europe that has been allowed to develop during 75 years of reliance on the US for defense grows painfully clear. Britain has not quite 3 days worth of ammo. Chathamhouse.org, otherwise known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs, a UK foreign policy think tank, warns that Europe may simply be unable to close the gap opened by the withdrawal of the United States. Quote, Lord Robertson's review of UK defense is expected to make clear how strained British armed forces are. It is thought to say that the entire UK forces have less than 3 days worth of ammunition, end quote. Chathamhouse.org warns that for Europe to defend itself without help from the US, the task would absorb almost all of the UK's military power. Quote, it remains to be seen if Europe's leaders can unify to shore up defense at a time of political uncertainty in France and Germany. Even if they can, it is far from clear that will be enough to deter an aggressive, badly mauled Russia absent the might of the United States, end quote. While Europe cries aloud at being forced to come up with funds if President Trump follows through on his threat, it's not that Europe does not have the money at all. It is rather that in scraping together the funds, European nations would have to cut into their more politically popular expenditures and also perhaps to go into debt. President Trump asked Europe to spend 5% of its gross domestic product on defense, which would double the amount it currently spends. Quote, to raise the money, European countries may have to consider loosening the fiscal rules that have governed their borrowing for more than a decade. Beyond that, they face unpalatable political choices, whether to pare back welfare, health, and pension benefits to pay for defense, a hard message to give to voters. For the UK, the choice is similar. This is a quote. Politicians of all parties have been steadfast behind Ukraine, but now they have to work out how to step up defense spending. The government has pledged to commit 2.5% of GDP, up from the current 2.3%, but not said by when, end quote. The bottom line, this is me talking again, is that Europe and Britain have standards of living that are now higher than Americans in many metrics. And here we're at really the nugget or the soul of this essay. The basic kind of assertion in this essay is that Europeans are doing better than America is right now, financially and in many ways. This is possible because European countries don't spend 5% of their GDP on defense. Europeans live better in many ways these days than do Americans. We who pay for 40% of the defense spending around the world, though our population is just 4.22% of the total world's population. I learned while I was in Europe that European elites' sense of what America is vis-a-vis Europe is out of date and unrealistic. It was clear to me that the emotional, the conceptual relationship between Europe and the US is oddly frozen in time. To Europe, in relation to America, it is always 1949. John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn imagines a scenario in which lovers are frozen in time, in which time has stood still. Quote, forever wilt thou love and she be fair, end quote. Historical consciousness seems to have frozen in a similar way for European-American relations. Forever, America is seen by the older nations as the bouncing, thoughtless, insanely wealthy young nation of the end of the war and the start of the post-World War II period. America will always have so much more money than Europe, and Europe will always desperately need America's money. Europe's sense of America is stuck in a moment when Italy and Germany were reduced to rubble and starving, when France was struggling with black market scarcity, and when British cities were blown to bits and the population reduced to gray austerity. Desperate Europeans post-war saw then, in film reels, Hollywood stars and starlets emerging in furs from limousines. They saw American tables laden with every kind of abundance. They saw golden sunbathers in Malibu and dashing skiers in Maine and endless Levitowns, complete with ample one-parent incomes. They saw teenagers with rec rooms and basements, middle-class homes with swimming pools and 2 cars, and modern appliances in every kitchen. Add to that a socialist influence on the continent that combines a sense of entitlement to wealth redistribution. Because America is so rich, therefore Europe is entitled to her funding in perpetuity. Well, that sense of who Europe is vis-a-vis America is just no longer accurate. President Trump, in my view, is trying to adjust our foreign policy to suit our actual fiscal and social reality in 2025. And Europe does not want to come along into the present. America is broke. We can't pay for our existing debt. We are no longer the robust, wealthy adolescent nation of the 1950s, in contrast to the desperate, starveling late 1940s Europe. America's middle class is not expanding as in the post-war period, but contracting. And here I have an image of people selling items on the street in New York, just looking pretty scruffy and broke. Europeans are trapped in a media bubble that does not allow them to update their sense of what America is. They see American TV and movies. Many studies confirm that those families represented by Hollywood are far more affluent than our average Americans. Europeans watch CNN. CNN does not usually cover desperate Americans still living in tents exposed to winter months after the floods in North Carolina and Western Virginia. Europeans don't see much coverage of American cities, from San Francisco to Los Angeles to New York, made dangerous and miserable by homelessness. They don't read stories of US college students living in their cars or of children whose only hot meal is lunch at school. They don't see stories of middle and even upper middle class Americans ruined by chronic illness or accidents or by one long hospital stay. Most Europeans have no idea how much Americans are suffering economically. They certainly don't consider deeply that many Americans are driven by these extreme economic pressures to enlist in the military, and that as that is the only way that many young men and women from working class or lower middle class or even middle class backgrounds can afford a college education or professional training, and that as a result, American society is filled relative to European societies with soldiers on active duty who may be put in harm's way if a war claims their service, and with veterans, many of them injured or psychologically broken by older wars that Europeans in comparable numbers did not have to fight. I was in Holland earlier this spring, and more recently we passed through Belgium, stayed for a week in Vilnius, Lithuania, passed again through Copenhagen, then transited through London for a week in Oxford, UK. I was in cities, so perhaps that skewed my impressions, as poverty in Europe and Britain, as in the US, is often rural. But still, compared to the crowds in America, Europeans, yes, this is impressionistic, and yes, there are surely exceptions, are better fed, better clothed, better housed, healthier, and far more visibly cheerful than our average crowds of Americans. European crowds in cities, and to a slightly lesser extent, British crowds in cities, are engaged very visibly in all of the kinds of things that make life worth living. They are eating well in restaurants. They're drinking wine and beer or taking coffee and tea with groups of friends in cafes. They're visiting museums to see classical and modern art exhibits and heading to traditional and innovative theatrical performances, with many of these cultural events subsidized by the state. The EU spends 74.9 billion euros a year, or nearly 1% of its government expenditure on, quote, cultural services, end quote. Europeans are engaging, and not just the rich, but the solidly middle class and even working people, in sporting activities, hiking, biking, skating, even skiing. They are playing with their kids. The maternity leave in the EU ranges from 60 to 100 days, with 40 extra days to be assigned at will to parental leave, meaning that dad can enjoy bonding time at home with baby as well. In many countries, this leave is 100% paid, as if the new parents were still at work. And there you see a chart of prenatal and postnatal funding for parental leave in Europe. Europeans compared to Americans, which obviously we don't have in the US, right? Some states let women or parents take 4 months off for parental leave, but it's not paid at 100%, nothing remotely like that. Europeans compared to Americans are planning lengthy holidays. The EU mandates at least 4 weeks annual vacation to its 27 member nations, and some countries give workers 6 weeks off a year. On weekends, from what I saw anyway, Europeans, in contrast to Americans, are retail shopping as if there is no tomorrow. American crowds these days, they look tense, withdrawn, and worried. You rarely see parents playing with their kids because parents are exhausted on weekends. New moms and dads do not get paid parental leave to be with their new baby, as I just mentioned a moment ago. Restaurants with high quality food are for the wealthy. A night at a bar with friends can wipe out a working or lower middle class worker's whole day's income. Museums, concerts, plays, dance performances, and festival tickets in the US are the prerogatives of the upper middle class or of the wealthy. There is little luxury or recreational shopping being done by Americans in the local malls or on Main Street. Retail sales plunged 0.9% in January of 2025 in the US. In the US, most people these days restrict their shopping to apprehensively watching the cashier add up their week's groceries. They anxiously watch the reading of the gas at the gas pump. Half of Americans surveyed by Bank of America say they are living paycheck to paycheck. Europeans score higher than we in the US do in terms of all of the key issues that determine quality of life. They have cheaper access to universities. 6 European countries offer students an entirely free college education. Europeans now have lower infant mortality rates than does the United States. The US ranks 51st in infant survival behind Croatia and lower than 4 European countries. Europeans have much higher literacy rates, 98.7%. In contrast, 43 million Americans have, quote, low literacy, end quote. Of course, most European nations have free universal health care. In contrast, Americans spend an average of $13,493 a year out of their household budgets on health care. I would argue that Europe can afford all of this art and culture and education and healthcare and festivity and family time and more, in large part because they are not paying their fair share for their own defense. Why would you not howl if faced with what it would actually mean in terms of daily quality of life in Europe and Britain to pay one's own fair share for defense and build up one's own army? The extraordinary, even magical perks of being European would soon erode or even vanish. Our stress, our 2 and 3 job homes, our families bankrupted by a single health emergency, our veterans living on the street, our latchkey kids who rarely see, let alone play with or read with or eat real meals with their parents, are paying for Europe's and Britain's relatively high levels of culture, relaxation, and luxury. This is an anomaly historically. European nations and entities have been fighting their own battles for the duration of Europe's recorded history, from the Trojan War in the 12th century BCE to the Norman invasion in 1066 to the 100 Years' War starting in 1337, the War of the Roses in 1455, to Cromwell's wars of 1654 to 1660, to the 7 Years' War in 1756, the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, and onward and upward till 1949. Dozens and dozens of conflicts and wars in every stage of its history, right up until the post-war period, have been fought by European nations and European entities' own armies. And there you have, I believe, a Napoleonic era image of combat, European combat. Lounging around on the subsidy of US defense dollars is a complete historical anomaly for Europe. After the relationship between Europe and the US froze in 1949, that led to 75 years of Europe behaving in an historically un-European way. In another essay, I'll explain how those years of relative armylessness allowed Europeans to lose agency, democracy, and healthy balances of power between citizens in relation to the state. And I'll just detour for a moment and explain, because I think it's important, that what I mean by that, and I'm reading a number of histories of Europe right now, actually one of them, the history of the Rothschild families, shows that when, and the other was a history of Britain by Roy Strong. How can I put this? Whenever there was tension, including the prospect of violent resistance between armies or citizens who could rise up in a violent way and the aristocracy and the king or the monarchy, that resulted in more and more representation, reform, parliamentary access, greater and greater democracy, democratic representation for citizens, more and more human rights, more and more equality in law, right, with elites. But now Europe has had 75 years of relative armylessness, as I put it. And in that time, the EU has managed to disarm Europeans, to suspend their sovereignty, to bring in millions of migrants against the wishes of citizens who are really quite, emasculated. I mean, I hate to use such a gendered word, but there isn't anything, that's non-gendered to say totally emasculated as a political entity. Now Europeans really don't have a lot of options. They're like in Britain, Keir Starmer is just stripping rights, ancient rights to free speech, rights to due process of law from Britons, and the British, putting people praying outside of abortion clinics in prison, or people, criticizing grooming gangs in prison for thoughts. And Europeans literally have no recourse, or British people have no recourse. The same, you're seeing the same thing in Europe. That's why there's this huge rise in Italy and in Germany and in the Netherlands of, what are derided as far-right parties. They're really just parties of sovereignty, I would say, and national security, national boundaries, national parliaments, right, national representation, going back to a kind of post-1848, early 20th century Europe, in which nations had boundaries and armies and so on. I'm not saying it's all roses. Obviously, the rationale for the EU message to many Europeans is, oh, if we get rid of borders, we won't have wars like World War I and World War II. We won't have European wars. I'm sure there's truth to that. But the downside is, without an army, you also can lose all your rights. You have no recourse whatsoever when you lose your rights. So that's my detour about 75 years of having no army, basically, in Europe, or no real army in European countries that belong to sovereign nations, right? And certainly being disarmed. Europeans are at the mercy of the EU now. All right. But for now, we must look to America and indeed put America first. It is time for an update in our relationship with our allies. We here in the US are broke, overworked, desperate, and miserable, while European life is relatively luxurious. Enough is enough. I think it is well past time for Europe to revise, to accord with reality, its sense of America, and also to have some compassion for our human suffering. It is well past time for Europe and the UK to form what I hope will be a healthy partnership with the United States, and in the process leave behind, in the mists of the past, a grossly outdated and ultimately parasitic dependency. So that is my essay about European wars and about Europe paying for its own wars. So let's see what you guys want to talk about. I don't see comments here. That could be me being a little bit unfamiliar with, oh, here's the comments. Here we go. Gary Pelzer says, if only. That's funny. Let's see. Paul Kane says, less wars, less spent on wars by everyone. That's certainly true. Rose Kelleher says, thank you. God bless you. Rose Kelleher, thank you for saying that. It's been a rough couple of weeks, a rough month, honestly, in some ways. And I appreciate you saying that, because I know that some people have been mad at me for other issues I've tried to raise, specifically in relation to Doge and cybersecurity. Again, I support what this administration is doing very largely. I think it's very important to do what it's doing securely and constitutionally. But I had begun to feel like there was kind of an impassable divide between me and my audience when we disagreed about something. And it's nice. I'm not saying you always have to agree with me. I think in a healthy democracy, we don't always agree with each other. We have good discussions. That's what I try to bring you always. Good fact-based discussions, open civil dialogue. But I appreciate your blessing. I really can use it. Happy St. Patrick's Day, Ireland, watching and listening carefully. Oh, thank you. Well, that may explain why you're still friendly toward me. You're not American, but I hope my American viewers and listeners will also consider, what I've been saying, and hopefully read my essay, How Not to Be a Patriot, which is about why sometimes being willing to criticize an administration is the greatest show of patriotism you can offer. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. I'm so happy to be married to an Irishman. I adore Irish culture, Irish civilization. My heart goes out to Ireland all the time as I see in the news. I mean, Ireland is such a good example of what I've been talking about, right? Because the Irish fought so hard for so long. I mean, going back, I believe, to the 18th century against British oppression and colonialism, famine, which turned out not to have been just bad luck in terms of nature blighting a potato crop, but definitely engineered as a kind of genocidal movement against the rights and the land ownership of the Irish people by the English, who took active steps in Parliament not to relieve their famine. And it had the effect of driving many Irish people off of their land, emigrating to the United States, to Canada, all over the world. This is a really good time to remember that, right? But my point is, the Irish, and then, I'm not ever, championing terrorism or attacks on civilians, but in the 1970s, the 1980s, Ireland fought hard. In the 1920s, Ireland fought so hard, right? Easter Uprising, for independence and for autonomy and sovereignty, for its right to have its own culture, speak its own language, right? Not be subject to, what was right up through the start of the 20th century, the greatest colonial power in the world, which was Britain. And many people died, many people lost their lives in the Republic of Ireland, what became the Republic of Ireland, and in Northern Ireland. And so it's painful to watch without a bullet being fired, the sovereignty of Ireland, the culture of Ireland, the language of Ireland, the wishes of the people being completely overrun by open borders and the importation of millions of people who don't share Irish values. I'm a daughter and granddaughter of immigrants, and I have nothing against legal immigration that countries choose, but this is not a choice by Ireland. And it's painful to see a people who have fought so hard for their own borders, their own language, their own culture, their own sovereignty, to lose it again, without even a declaration of war. I mean, I'm not saying there should be a declaration of war, but it is effectively a war against the Irish. Anyway, happy St. Patrick's Day, and let's hope for better times with more sovereignty for everyone. Gary Pelzer says, interesting points. We need to have each other's backs. The greater Americas and Europe. That being said, most of Southeastern Europe is in greatest danger, not really Central and Northern Europe. Southeastern Europe is broke. It is more on par with Africa economics, really. It is that part of Europe that needs US help. I agree Northern Europe needs to give up coffee to support itself. Thank you for always making us think. Thank you. That's really well said. It's interesting. I'll think about that. By Southeastern Europe, what do you mean exactly? What countries? I'd be interested to see in the comments what countries specifically you're thinking about. James Green says the Baconian project of empirical information gathering accompanied Britain in Europe's militaristic expansion around the world. Now does this dynamic of periphery and metropole turn rapaciously upon the home society? Wow, that is a mouthful, Mr. Green. Interesting. I see what you're saying, that Europe and Britain kind of committed empire in military expansion around the world, and now it's kind of coming back to bite Europe. And well, that's true. That's interesting. That's true. I think that's correct. Europe occupied other people's countries. Now other people are occupying Europe. I think that's well said. And Gary Pelzer said he's American, by the way. Thank you. It's really nice to reconnect with my American friends as well as my global friends. Frederick Gramco says, check out the Mike Wallace interview with Henry Kissinger. Kissinger tells us that, quote, we will never have an all-out nuclear war. We will only have small protruding wars from here on out. That was 1958. That's really interesting. I wonder how he knew that. Well, he was an architect of the post-war order. So I'd love to know more. I will check out that interview. Thank you, Mr. Gramco. Gary Pelzer explains what he means by Southeastern Europe: Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, those around the Black Sea. That's very, very interesting. I'll have to find out more about that. So are they poorer? I mean, this is not to be callous, but are they poorer now than they were when they were Soviet satellites? And what would ease their poverty? I'm just like less and less thinking that direct aid ultimately eases people's poverty. I think investment does. But let's talk more about that. I'd love to know more about that. And I'm sure that that's true. I'm sure you're right. And that's really worth thinking about. So that's also interesting because Western and Northern Europe, to my knowledge, are not kind of giving aid to Southeastern Europe, to these poor people or struggling people in Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Very, very interesting. Well, folks, we've come a little bit to the end of our time, and Gary Pelzer says yes. If there's no other observations, questions, comments, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. It's so rainy out. It's crazy. The weather here in upstate New York is insanely wet and bleak. And I really hope RFK Jr. tackles weather engineering, because it does not seem natural for early, mid-spring, mid-March. It's very, very, very gray and wet and relentless. But I hope the weather is normal wherever you are. I know that there's similar strange weather all over Western Europe. I was blessedly, as I mentioned, in India for a week, and there was no geoengineering that I could see. I saw one contrail that didn't disperse the whole week I was there, which really makes me think we should look closely at the Chinese connection to geoengineering, because India has nukes pointed at China. And I also didn't see the kind of interference in their culture that we're seeing in Western Europe and North America. Like, there was no trans discourse. Again, I support LGBTQ rights, but I feel like a lot of the trans discussion is very artificial, aimed at dissolving the family, creating dissension, creating divisions. The family was intact, the culture was intact. I mean, I'm sure India has its problems, but it just didn't feel manipulated by globalists the way that America and Western Europe have felt manipulated by globalists to me since 2020. So that's just a note. It made me really happy to be there. And I didn't, again, I didn't see any weather manipulation at all. I saw golden sun, which like literally I haven't seen for 15 years in the West. Golden sun, the whole vibe. And I think I want to look further into whether 5G has been switched on in India and whether that's a factor, because, Earth everything felt real the way it used to in the West, 10 or 15 years ago, solid. As opposed to a lot of people are talking, and you're my friends, I'll just say this. A lot of people are saying things don't feel real. It feels like we're in some sort of simulation or, matrix or hologram. Here in the West since 2020, I don't want to believe it. I don't have any evidence for how that might be true, but it just feels that way, right? Something's off, something's weird. And so it was a great relief to me to go to India and feel that it felt like Earth. It felt very solid. It felt very grounded. Who knows why? We'll find out more about that. I hope wherever you are in the world, things feel solid and grounded. I hope wherever you are in the world, the sun is golden and the frogs and bees are, being froggy and bee-ish. And Fred, okay, let's see. Kim Mountjoy says, God bless you and all you do for humanity, and more of those graces come like this you do. Oh, so nice. Thank you, Kim Mountjoy, and same to you. Frederick Gramco says, in the novel 1984, there was an all-out continual war in Eurasia. Isn't that where we are today? Yes, you got it. That right there, exactly. Thank you for that very literate observation. I'd forgotten that. Barry Atkinson, hello, friend. Barry Atkinson has been our friend for over a decade, my goodness, since at least 2014. And he says, thank you for your essay. You're the best. Thank you. I appreciate you guys so much. Frederick Gramco says, a glitch in the matrix, so to speak. Again, I hope not, but tell me I'm wrong, you guys. Don't things feel a little weird and off in the West? Like, I keep waiting for normal life to return. But hopefully, if we all raise our consciousness, normal life will return, or maybe better than normal life will return. Let's not forget, it's also some gigantic eclipse. Like there's a big astrological transit going on. I'm not a wholesale believer in that, especially not Western astrology, but Hindu astrology has been a science for thousands of years. When I was in Jaipur, I actually was taken to an incredible astrological kind of park that was created, I think, in the 18th century by one of the Maharajas. It was these huge astrological instruments that, marked the movement of the planets in extraordinary detail, very, very, very scientifically. And he planned his wars, based on what the planets were doing. And I guess he was, pretty successful, but it's a much more scientific discipline, Hindu astrology, than Western astrology. So I'm not saying I know or understand what this giant transit is, this giant eclipse. I think it's called a blood moon. But I definitely feel the unsettled feeling, again, especially here in the United States. And hopefully we'll get through it to something better, continuing to evolve and reach for love, peace, harmony, enlightenment, kindness, goodness. What a perfect way to end. Rose Kelleher from Ireland says perfectly, things are very off. However, God is still in his heaven. Thank you. Perfect. And on that note, we'll end, and I'll see you very, very soon. Thank you for tuning in. And remember to support us at Daily Clout, subscribe or donate. independent news and opinion. Plus, you can share bills live on social media, find out what's going on in the US legislature. We hope to have 132 countries with bill cams of their own very soon. And remember to support me over on Substack. My Substack is Outspoken. And Frederick Graham says, what percentage of the American population has cognitive dissonance? Love you and God. Again, a perfect note to end on. My friends and family around the world, bless your hearts. Mailing address, I will tell you, Daily Cloud or Naomi Wolf, P.O. Box 24, Millerton, New York, 12546. And that's on our website, Daily Cloud, in case you didn't write it down. Thank you all so much. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye. Be well.